Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast series on industry and market analysis, an initiative brought to you by marketresearchreports.com. In this series, our hosts, Mike and Samantha, discuss key aspects of selected topics, providing valuable insights tailored for business professionals and decision makers. For those with limited time to navigate countless articles and videos, they'll do the legwork for you, delivering concise and actionable information. Let's get started.
We're constantly surrounded by the results of global trade, but, one sector that operates largely behind the scenes yet really underpins our very sustenance is the agrochemical trade. We're talking about fertilizers, pesticides, moving across borders. It's a massive undertaking, trillions of dollars, millions of tons. The scale is almost hard to grasp sometimes.
It really is. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. This deep dive, it focuses right on that global agrochemical trade scenario. Specifically, we're looking at the countries importing and consuming these, essential agricultural inputs.
Right.
And our analysis today, it's drawing directly from information provided by marketresearchreports.com.
And this isn't our first look at this critical area, is it? I think we previously explored the producers, the exporters, the big companies involved.
Exactly. So this installment, it really complements that first one, gives us a much fuller picture of this vital global industry. Because understanding who the major consumers and importers are, the volumes, the money involved, it provides crucial context. It touches on everything: global food security, economic stability, even the push towards more sustainable farming.
Right. It connects to a lot of listener interests, potentially.
Precisely. So our aim is to really cut through the noise and pull out the key insights for you from this data.
All right, so what's our plan then? How are we navigating this complex landscape? What are the essential bits we're going to explore?
Okay, so we'll start by establishing the sheer magnitude of it all.
Yeah.
Global fertilizer and pesticide trade, and the significant shifts we've seen just recently.
Okay.
From there, we'll pinpoint the leading countries, who's importing, who's consuming the most.
Got it.
We'll also look at the role of organic alternatives. Are they making a dent yet? And then the strategic risks. What happens when you rely so heavily on imports?
Yeah, that's crucial.
And finally, resilience. What strategies are nations actually adopting to make their supply chains stronger?
Sounds comprehensive. So let's start with the scale. Getting a handle on just how vast this trade is. What does that enormous quantity really look like?
Well, the data from marketresearchreports.com really emphasizes those enormous quantities. And the last few years, particularly dynamic. Big price spikes, geopolitical stuff happening. Just to give you a number, global spending on imported fertilizers peaked at $153 billion in 2022. That's a huge jump.
Wow, $153 billion.
Yeah. Now, prices did moderate a bit in 2023. Spending dropped to about $101 billion. But that volatility, it really highlights how sensitive this market is.
That kind of swing must have caused some serious ripples. I remember the information pointing out how countries like Brazil, India, the U.S., they all felt that big jump in import costs, didn't they?
Absolutely. And what's really revealing is how that volatility just underscored the dependence many nations have on outside sources for these basic farm inputs.
Right.
And while fertilizer spending was up and down, the trend for pesticide use, that's been steadily upward. Global pesticide use hit 3.70 million tons of active ingredients in 2022.
3.7 million tons.
Yeah, that's a 4% increase from just the year before. And remarkably, it's double the level seen back in 1990.
Double since 1990. That's quite something. What's driving that continuous rise, according to the report?
The report connects it directly to intensifying agriculture in major economies. Basically, as countries push for more output, feeding growing populations, meeting global demand, they're leaning more heavily on pesticides to protect crops.
Makes sense, but...
But, as the info also suggests, this reliance brings vulnerabilities, right? And raises big questions about long-term sustainability. The drive for self-sufficiency, it's all linked.
Okay, so massive volumes, big money, especially with fertilizers. Who are the main players on the import side? Who's spending the most?
Right. Let's look at the top fertilizer importers in 2023. 5 nations basically accounted for about 43% of all global import spending.
Almost half, just 5 countries.
Yep. Leading the way was Brazil.
Yeah.
That spent $14.6 billion, roughly 14.4% of the global total.
Okay, Brazil first.
Then India at $10.4 billion, the U.S. at $9.8 billion. And China and France rounded out that top 5 at $5.6 billion and $2.9 billion, respectively.
Those are hefty sums. It's interesting seeing China in that top tier, though, given how much fertilizer they produce themselves.
That's a really important distinction. China imports a lot, yes, but several others also have big import bills. Australia, Turkey, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, Canada. They were all in the $2 to $2.5 billion range in 2023.
So a second tier of big importers.
Exactly. And if you look at sheer volume, not just spending, Brazil stands out even more. In 2022, they imported something like 38 million tons of fertilizer products, way more than most others.
38 million tons. So Brazil's a major player by value and volume. What about consumption, though? Are the biggest importers automatically the biggest users?
Not always. China, as we mentioned, is actually the world's biggest consumer of fertilizers. Over 50 million tons of domestic nutrient use.
Over 50 million. Wow.
But here's the key thing. China is largely self-sufficient. They produce most of what they need and even export some years.
Right, that's different.
India is the second biggest consumer. Around 30.6 million tons of nutrients in 2023-24, which is maybe 64.8 million tons of actual fertilizer products. But unlike China, India really relies on imports for key stuff like phosphates and potash.
Okay, so India consumes a lot and imports a lot for certain nutrients.
Exactly. Then you have the U.S. and Brazil next in line for consumption. The U.S. uses about 10% of global nutrients, Brazil around 8%.
So a key takeaway seems to be a few big players drive demand, but their import reliance really varies depending on their own production, right?
Precisely.
And the report mentioned Brazil, India, the U.S. They've all topped the import charts in different ways or times and all felt those big price spikes in 2022.
Exactly right. That volatility really just hammers home how interconnected and maybe unstable the global fertilizer market can be.
Now, the information from marketresearchreports.com also mentioned organic and biofertilizers. Are these alternatives actually making a dent in this huge trade in synthetics?
Based on the data, not really, not yet. The report says organics and biofertilizers are still a tiny fraction of global trade compared to synthetics.
Tiny? How tiny?
Well, in 2023, only about 1.1% of the value of international fertilizer trade was organic fertilizers. Now, volume-wise, their share is bigger because things like manure and compost are low-cost, bulky stuff.
Ah, okay. Lower value, higher volume.
Right. And even if you add in the newer biofertilizers, the overall market presence is still quite small compared to conventional stuff. The global organic fertilizer market was maybe $12 billion in 2024. That's like 5–6% of the total market.
So lots of talk, lots of interest, but they haven't scaled up enough to challenge synthetics in global trade yet. The report did say countries are encouraging them, though.
Oh, yes, definitely. Many nations are promoting organic amendments, biofertilizers, trying to supplement or maybe partly replace chemical fertilizers. It's often part of bigger sustainability plans.
So maybe gradual growth ahead.
That's the potential, yes.
Yeah.
But they're starting from a pretty small base right now.
Okay, let's switch gears to pesticides. Who are the big importers and consumers there? Is it a similar story?
Somewhat similar, yeah. Brazil again pops up as the world's largest importer of agricultural pesticides. In 2022, their imports were over $7.1 billion.
Wow, over $7 billion just on pesticides.
But that number did drop back to around $4.9 billion in 2023, probably market adjustments, currency stuff.
Okay, who else is importing a lot of pesticides?
After Brazil, you've got France, Canada, Germany, and the United States as other major importers.
Interesting that the U.S. imports a lot of both fertilizers and pesticides, even with its strong domestic fertilizer production.
That's a good point. And if you look at pesticide use versus just imports, the picture changes a bit. India and China, for instance, use a lot of pesticides.
Right.
But they're actually net exporters, or mostly self-sufficient. China exports a lot of active ingredients, and India's generic industry serves both home and abroad.
So they use a lot, but make their own, basically.
Pretty much. In terms of who uses the absolute most globally, that's China. The U.S. and Brazil are also right up there among the top consumers.
Okay. And Europe. You mentioned France imports a lot.
Yes, but overall pesticide use in the EU, including France, has actually seen a bit of a decline in recent decades. Strict regulations are a big factor there.
Makes sense. And what about organic options for pest control? Are biopesticides doing better than organic fertilizers?
They're definitely a growing area, biopesticides and organic crop protection, but still a minority share overall. The global biopesticides market was maybe $8–9 billion in 2024. That's about 10% of the total pesticide market.
Okay, 10% is more significant than the organic fertilizer share, but still.
Still relatively small globally, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
North America and Europe are leading the way in adoption, driven by regulations and consumer demand for food with fewer residues.
Mm-hmm.
You even see places like parts of Oceania where biopesticides are a pretty big chunk of insecticide use. But in the major agricultural economies, conventional chemicals still dominate.
But governments are setting targets to change that, right? Like the EU.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The EU's Green Deal is a prime example, aiming for a 50% cut in chemical pesticide use and risk by 2030. That's ambitious.
Very ambitious. If they meet targets like that, it could really shift import patterns, especially in Europe.
For sure. But globally, the big importers and consumers are still mainly those with huge conventional farming systems. The move towards bio options, while it's growing, is still early days in many parts of the world.
Okay. The information from marketresearchreports.com also had some really good country-specific case studies. They really show the import dependence and trends. Let's dig into a few, maybe starting with Brazil, so they keep coming up as a major importer of both.
Yeah, Brazil's a fascinating case. Huge agricultural producer, right?
Yeah.
But highly dependent on imported fertilizers. About 85% of their needs come from imports.
85%.
And it's even higher for specific nutrients, like
Yeah.
95% for nitrogen, 75% for phosphates, and a full 100% for potash. They import all their potash.
100%. That sounds like a serious strategic vulnerability.
It is. And Brazilian policymakers see it that way too. That's why they launched a national fertilizer plan back in 2022. The goal is ambitious. Cut import dependence down to 45% by 2050.
How do they plan to do that?
While reviving domestic production is key, exploring their own phosphate and potash reserves, and also actively promoting organic fertilizers, and just using fertilizers more efficiently.
That huge price spike in 2022 must have really lit a fire under those efforts. The report said their fertilizer import bill almost doubled that year.
It did. Hit a record $27 billion. It just clearly showed how vulnerable they were to global markets. So yeah, reducing that exposure is a national priority now. Food security depends on it.
Okay, what about India, another agricultural giant? What's their import situation look like?
India is the second biggest fertilizer consumer. They have more developed domestic industry than Brazil, especially for nitrogen-based urea. They mostly meet their own urea needs.
So they're better off with nitrogen.
Yes, but they're still heavily dependent on imports for phosphates and, critically, 100% for potash, just like Brazil. No domestic potash reserves.
Ah, so potash is the big vulnerability there too.
It is. And that reliance means big government subsidy bills when global prices shoot up.
Right. So what's their strategy?
Expanding domestic urea production even further. They've got new plants aiming for self-sufficiency by 2025. They're also looking at things like nano-urea. For phosphates and potash, it's about diversifying import sources, even investing in mines overseas. The big theme is Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India in fertilizers.
That self-reliance theme seems common. What about a developed country like the U.S.?
The U.S. is interesting. Major consumer, yes, but also significant domestic production, especially nitrogen and phosphates. They've got plenty of natural gas and phosphate rock.
So less vulnerable overall.
Their main import dependence is really just for potash, about 93% imported, but most of that comes from Canada, which is a very stable, reliable partner.
Okay, so the risk isn't availability so much as maybe price or market concentration.
Exactly. They've also started programs to boost domestic fertilizer production, trying to increase resilience and competition in their own market.
Let's turn to Europe. The report mentioned France and the EU more broadly. Their situation seems complex with those environmental goals they have.
Yeah, France is the EU's biggest agricultural producer, and they're a net importer of both fertilizers and pesticides. The natural gas crisis in 2021-22 really hit EU fertilizer production hard.
Because natural gas is a key ingredient, right?
Exactly. So production dropped, and they became more reliant on imports, sometimes even from Russia, which created obvious tensions.
Yeah, balancing supply security, climate goals, geopolitics, tricky.
Very tricky. So now the EU, including France, is pushing hard for domestic low-carbon fertilizer production, and also trying to cut overall agrochemical use through things like the farm-to-fork strategy, aiming for 25% organic land by 2030, 50% cut in pesticide risk.
That's a major policy shift, trying to balance farming output with environmental goals.
It is, and it really highlights the challenge for developed economies trying to shrink their agrochemical footprint while keeping agriculture strong.
The report also touched on others: Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, Australia. Australia seemed particularly exposed now, since they closed their last urea plant.
That's right. Australia is now almost completely dependent on imports for fertilizers. They're looking at things like green ammonia production, increasing storage,
Yeah.
trying to build resilience since their imports often come from far away.
So, looking across all these examples, it's clear synthetics are still king, but there's this growing interest everywhere in organic and biological options. How is that trend actually playing out in the market, according to the data?
Well, like we touched on, the policy goals and market buzz around organics and biologicals are definitely rising. You see active promotion in Brazil, India, Europe.
Yeah.
The EU's organic farming target is a big signal.
Right.
But the current market reality. These products mostly complement synthetics. They don't replace them yet on a large scale. Their share of the market value is still pretty low.
So, more integration than a replacement for now.
Exactly. We are seeing promising trends in using organic practices alongside synthetics to reduce overall dependency. Things like integrated pest management, better soil management, and the big agrochemical companies. They're investing in biosolutions too. They see where things are potentially heading.
But bottom line for now.
Bottom line, for the near term at least, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides remain pretty critical for hitting the crop yields we need globally.
It sounds like a gradual shift then. Potential for growth in organics and bio, but synthetics aren't going away anytime soon.
That's a fair way to put it. The balance is shifting, driven by policy and markets, but the sheer scale of global agriculture today still requires a heavy reliance on synthetics. The challenge is scaling up those organic and agroecological methods effectively.
Okay, let's talk about the risks tied to this import dependency. The report mentions several, and that 2022 price volatility must have really brought them home.
Oh, absolutely. The price spikes were a brutal lesson in volatility risk. Countries heavily reliant on imports, especially developing ones, faced huge economic pressure when fertilizer prices more than doubled.
Many just couldn't afford enough, right? Leading to smaller harvests.
Exactly. Reduced harvests, more food insecurity, it hit hard. Analyses really showed how vulnerable they were. Even richer nations like Brazil and India saw massive strains on their budgets from those import bills.
And it's not just price, is it? There's the risk of supply actually being cut off due to geopolitics, the Russia-Ukraine war, Belarus sanctions. Those were big examples.
Huge examples. Suddenly, a big chunk of the world's potash and ammonia trade was uncertain. Countries relying on those sources had to scramble for alternatives.
And China temporarily restricting exports showed how one country's decision can ripple outwards, too.
Precisely. And then there are logistical risks, too, right? Like the recent Red Sea disruptions. That can mess with the transit of essential inputs as well.
So supply risks, price risks. What about broader economic impacts? Draining foreign reserves, trade balances getting worse.
All major concerns. Huge import bills put a massive strain on developing economies. If their currency weakens, imports become even more expensive. And relying too much on just one supplier, that's a classic vulnerability.
Like the EU relying on Russian gas for fertilizer production.
That's a perfect example of those complex geopolitical dependencies. And beyond economics, there are environmental risks too, maybe overusing cheap imports, pests developing resistance, potential carbon costs down the line.
Okay, so given all these risks, price, supply, economic, environmental, grivel, what are countries actually doing to build resilience? What strategies does the report highlight?
Two main strategies really come through: boosting domestic production and diversifying where they get imports from.
We talked about boosting production, India, Brazil, the U.S. doing that, green ammonia potentially helping long-term too.
Right. And the other side is promoting alternatives and just being more efficient, using precision agriculture, developing crops that need fewer nutrients. That helps reduce demand.
And on the import side, diversification is key.
Absolutely key. Countries are actively trying not to put all their eggs in one basket. Broadening their supplier base mitigates risk. Brazil shifting where it got its potash after 2022 is a clear case of this.
What else are they doing?
Things like government-to-government deals, building up strategic stockpiles of key inputs, even investing in fertilizer plants in other countries to secure supply. Plus, regional cooperation, private sector efforts on logistics. It's multifaceted.
And sustainability fits in here too, doesn't it? Using less, integrating organics, that builds resilience in a way.
It definitely does. Reducing overuse, using more diverse methods. It makes the whole system less brittle, less dependent on potentially volatile inputs.
So it really sounds like the period from 2021 to 2024 was a wake-up call, prompting a lot of major importers to take real steps to secure their agro input supplies.
That's a really important takeaway from the information, yes. whether it's more domestic production, finding more suppliers, promoting sustainability. The trend is definitely towards trying to build more resilience and self-reliance in this whole agrochemical landscape.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into a world that's usually quite hidden, the global agrochemical trade. It's amazing to get a sense of the scale, the dependencies, and the big shifts happening right now.
It really is. So just to quickly recap, we looked at the huge, often volatile global trade in fertilizers and pesticides. The fact that synthetics still dominate, even with growing interest in alternatives, the very real strategic risks of relying too much on imports, especially shown by recent events, and the different ways countries are trying to build more resilience.
And as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on. With all these global dynamics shifting, how will this tension between countries wanting self-sufficiency and the reality of a deeply connected global agricultural supply chain, how will that ultimately reshape what we grow and how we grow it?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? It's something critical to watch. And if listeners want to explore more, digging into those specific country strategies or the future of sustainable agriculture would be great places to start. The information even hints at maybe looking at trade wars and tariffs next time. Another complex layer.
Definitely food for thought. Ultimately, getting a better handle on this global agrochemical picture is just so essential for understanding our food systems, the challenges, and the opportunities ahead.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and found it valuable for enhancing your knowledge and understanding. Don't forget to browse our website, marketresearchreports.com, where you'll find tens of thousands of research reports spanning various industries. These insights are designed to empower decision makers and help you stay ahead of the competition.